So I'm going to make this point about, I'm going to make this video about one point about free speech, which was emphasized in the manufacturing consent documentary, which I'm sure you've all seen many times like I have, which is a simple point, and it's an obvious point, and it's a point that used to be pretty much dogma for the left, but it's something that people on the right usually didn't disagree, they usually disagreed with, and I don't know what centrists think, but the left kind of got it. But now that's kind of changing. The right still pretty much doesn't get it, although they seem to be saying they care more about free speech, but we don't know how authentic that is. I'm sure it is for some people. But the left, unfortunately, is not as much of a fan. And polls bear this out, and also, like, anybody paying attention can see it as well. Like the ACLU, there's just a big expose in the New York Times a couple months ago about how they haven't put free speech in any of their newsletters or their updates on their yearly activities in a number of years, and a number of their main lawyers aren't big fans of it anymore. And as the old generation leaves, the ideology of the ACLU has changed to be a much more partisan lean and much less in favor of everybody having free speech. And what people on the left, I use the left, I don't know, loosely here, but we know what I'm talking about. What they'll say, what younger people on the left, what liberals, liberal intelligentsia and the Democratic Party kind of types say about it is that, we're in favor of free speech, but we aren't in favor of free speech. There's these free speech absolutists. They're kind of just ridiculous idiots that are absolutely over the top with their free speech demands, and that's not what we're in favor of. But that's not the case. Nobody is advocating for the right to say absolutely anything to absolutely anyone at absolutely any time. What we're actually arguing for is what the left, and by the left I mean the anti-war movement back in the 60s and 70s, which was closely tied to the free speech movement on Berkeley and elsewhere, which was closely tied to the civil rights movement during the same period. The concept that they fought for and were able to actually get established as maybe the best thing in all of America. There's a lot of problems here, but we have probably the best protections for free speech. And the reason that people like the civil rights movement and civil rights leaders would advocate for that is that they knew through their experience that states like Georgia and South Carolina and Alabama and the Deep South would stop them from using their free speech rights and having protests or advocating on issues, because they said that if we allow this, this is going to lead to violence. So we can't allow these advocates to advocate for what they're advocating, because that's going to lead to violence. And what the courts finally, through a bunch of pressure and through the changes that the left was able to introduce, said that no, sorry, unless there's an immediate, imminent threat of violence, i.e., you have a mob of people outside of business, and they say, all right, go get them. That's you're not allowed to do that speech. You're not allowed to do other speech. You're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded building. And that, incidentally, that's a Supreme Court rule. That's a common quote, and I see people like AOC use it all the time when they call for things like censorship against right-wingers. Well, that quote actually comes from, I agree, and you're still not allowed to do it. But the context of that quote, if I remember correctly, was from a ruling against Eugene Debs during the First World War, Eugene Debs being the head of the Socialist Party, when the administration decided to throw him in jail for advocating against the war. So he's like, oh, sorry, you can't say everything, you free speech absolutist. Can't yell fire in a crowded theater, and you can't argue for socialist things or for nonviolent things when in the times of war. And that's always what it's been used for. So it's always been directed against the left. So for so much of the left, including much of the NAACP, not NAACP, but maybe them too, but I don't know, but the ACLU and the Squad and a lot of pretty much people all over the place, if you pay any attention, to be saying we're not free speech absolutist is interesting, and it's not a good thing. I say that all just to lead into this clip from Manufacturing Consent from Noam Chomsky, which is his most famous work by far, his most famous book, and here's the movie that was accompanying it, where he talks about the concept of free speech.
I do not think that the state ought to have the right to determine historical truth and to punish people who deviate from it. I'm not willing to give the state that right, even if they happen to
But are you denying that the gas chambers ever existed?
But I'm saying if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. I mean, Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech. Now, you can decide which position you want. With regard to my defense of the utterly offensive, the people who express utterly offensive views, I haven't the slightest doubt that every commissar says, you're defending that person's views. No, I'm not. I'm defending his right to express them. The difference is crucial, and the difference has been understood outside of fascist circles since the 18th century.
Is there anything like objectivity, scientific objectivity, reality? As a scientist,
look, I'm not saying I defend the views. Look, if somebody publishes a scientific article, which I disagree with, I do not say the state ought to put him in jail, right?
All right, but you don't have to support him right away and say, I support him just for the sake of everybody saying that, whatever he wants to say.
Suppose this guy is taken to court and charged with falsification. Then I'm going to defend him, even if I disagree.
But he wasn't taken to court.
Oh, you're wrong.
But when did you write the support? I mean,
when he was brought to court. And in fact, the only support that I gave him is to say he has a right of freedom of speech, period.
There is no doubt in my mind that the example that I gave about this story is the Holocaust did not exist is very, very typical. I'll give you another example about
how much of the American press believes that Faurisson has anything to say, or any press? How much of the press in France?
Since I followed...
What percentage would you say?
I'll tell you.
Is it higher than zero?
Is it
higher than zero?
I'll tell you.
Have you ever seen anything in any newspaper or any journal saying that this man is anything other than a lunatic?
I'll try to answer. I'll try to answer. I think that I just followed the case.
That's a simple question.
I followed the case 5 or 6 years ago, and I happened to see that Noam Chomsky was in for strong criticism even from some of his supporters for doing something which could be interpreted only in terms of a campaign against Israel.
Going back years, I am absolutely certain that I've taken far more extreme positions on people who deny the Holocaust than you have. For example, you go back to my earliest articles and you will find that I say that even to enter into the arena of debate on the question of whether the Nazis carried out such atrocities is already to lose one's humanity. So I don't even think you ought to discuss the issue if you want to know my opinion. But if anybody wants to refute Faurisson, there's certainly no difficulty in doing so.
I'm not interested in freedom of speech and all that. I have to win, and that's the question. And I shall win.
So I don't think I can add much to that other than to say that's highly at odds and in a lot of tension with the concept of what we need to do around free speech by a lot of the left today, which says things like, yeah, we support free speech, but not this absolutism, and definitely not misinformation. We can't have misinformation online. This is hurting people. We can't have white nationalists give their free speech. They're too bad. We can't have Trump or some of the things he said. This is misinformation. It's getting people hurt. Yeah, that's what happens. Like in a free society, people have bad information and that gets people hurt. But the alternative is an authoritarian mindset, which is equivalent to what happened, as he said, in Nazi Germany, with Stalin, with authoritarian regimes around the world over, that usually then use that power to attack the left, as has happened frequently throughout American history as well. And so it's not a good trend, and I just thought I would highlight that clip.